I always thought a vegetable garden was a harmless pastime, until HOA Karen made it her personal mission to destroy everything I'd grown. Before we jump into this unbelievable story about how I discovered my backyard was ground zero for an all-out HOA war, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment if you've ever faced a neighbor who just couldn't mind their own business. When my husband Daniel and I bought our cozy home in Greenwood Acres, we were thrilled by the ample backyard that got great sunlight most of the day. For a budding gardener like me, it was paradise waiting to happen. I spent weeks prepping the soil, adding compost, and sectioning off areas for tomatoes, bell peppers, cucumbers, and a few rows of herbs. Every day, I'd step outside to check on the progress, feeling immense pride each time a new leaf emerged or a flower blossomed. It was the simplest joy, growing our own food. Greenwood Acres had an HOA, but their rules seemed fairly standard. The day we moved in, the association's president, Karen, dropped off a welcome packet. She was polite with a prim haircut and an overly bright smile. "We look forward to you maintaining the community's aesthetic standards," she'd said, her tone half friendly, half foreboding. I brushed it off. After all, how could a garden be a threat to aesthetics? A month went by peacefully. My veggies thrived under the summer sun, and our neighbors even asked for gardening tips. One elderly couple next door, the Jeffersons, admired my neat rows of lettuce and spinach, remarking how lovely it was to see someone using the land so productively. I started planning to expand the garden the following year, maybe adding pumpkins or strawberries. Then, just as my tomatoes were ripening into plump red orbs, trouble arrived in the form of a letter. It read, "We have received complaints about your backyard garden. The HOA guidelines state that all landscaping must be approved, and vegetable plots may not exceed a certain size or disrupt the uniformity of the neighborhood. Please remove or reduce your garden within 2 weeks to avoid fines. Karen." I was stunned. I had scanned the HOA bylaws when we moved in, and I recalled nothing that specifically prohibited vegetable gardens. The letter cited a vague line about maintaining visually pleasing landscaping, but it didn't mention vegetables at all. I shared the note with Daniel, who shook his head in disbelief. "Your garden's gorgeous, not an eyesore. She's just being petty." Curious if others had faced similar issues, I spoke to the Jeffersons. Mrs. Jefferson confided, "Karen once tried to tell us we couldn't have more than 3 potted plants on our front porch. She acts like she owns the whole neighborhood." Encouraged, I politely emailed Karen, asking for clarification. She responded with a short message that repeated her stance. Vegetable gardens are not aligned with the community's decorative standards. She also threatened that if I didn't comply, I'd face escalating fines. What I didn't realize was that Karen wasn't just opposed to the look of my garden, she had another motive entirely. Over the next several weeks, I would uncover information about a hidden alliance, a shocking misuse of the HOA's authority, and one last desperate ploy to sabotage my hard work. Little did Karen know, I had the law on my side, and once it came into play, her entire scheme would crumble in the most dramatic way possible. I refused to tear up my garden. Instead, I dove deeper into the HOA bylaws. Sure enough, there was nothing explicitly forbidding vegetable gardens. Some lines talked about consistent landscaping and non-disruptive horticulture, but in no place did it mention vegetables as being a violation. Moreover, a neighbor pointed out a new state law that encouraged home gardens for sustainability. In many places, HOAs could not outright ban people from growing food on their own property, as long as it didn't cause safety or property damage concerns. Determined to defend my tomatoes and cucumbers, I prepared a formal rebuttal. I sent Karen a certified letter citing the specific sections of the HOA bylaws and referencing the state legislation that protected a homeowner's right to grow food. I also CC'd the rest of the HOA board. I expected a swift apology or at least a concession. Instead, I got the silent treatment. 2 days later, a bright orange sticker appeared on the gate to my backyard, stating, "Notice of violation, property not in compliance." It threatened a $200 fine if I didn't remove unapproved vegetation within 7 days. Furious, I took photos of everything, including the sticker, and started documenting every interaction. I also decided to meet with a local lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, recommended by a friend. His name was Sam, and he had a list of high-profile HOA takedowns under his belt. Meanwhile, Daniel tried to keep me calm, reminding me that we had the law on our side. But the notion that someone could demand I destroy my perfectly healthy, harmless garden felt deeply wrong. I took to an online neighborhood forum, seeking others who might have faced similar bullying. Sure enough, a handful of residents had run-ins with Karen over planting fruit trees, building small greenhouses, or even having too many bushes. Some caved in and removed their plants to avoid conflict. Others moved away entirely. One evening, as I was watering my bell peppers, the Jeffersons waved me over to their fence. Mr. Jefferson whispered, "Karen's real uptight about anything she doesn't like. Heard from a board member she wants everyone's yard to look uniform, just grass and ornamental shrubs. She had a shouting match with another neighbor who tried to plant wildflowers." He paused, then added, "But I also heard she might be working with a landscaping company that charges big fees to fix violations. They come in, tear out whatever Karen deems offensive, and get paid a hefty sum by the homeowner or the HOA itself." That sounded like a racket to me. If Karen was funneling neighborhood projects to a specific landscaping company, was she getting kickbacks? My lawyer, Sam, told me it's not uncommon for unscrupulous HOA presidents to have side deals. The best way to confirm is to see the contracts or the HOA's financial records. I wondered if I was dealing with the tip of an iceberg. Maybe my garden threatened Karen's arrangement because it was a shining example of something people could do themselves without paying for fancy landscaping. As if on cue, a few days later, I got another letter from the HOA. This one was more ominous, stating that if I did not comply, they would forcibly remove my garden and charge me for the cost of removal. The letter also mentioned something about contractors on standby. At that point, I realized I needed to act fast. If they sent people to tear up my yard, I'd lose everything I'd worked for in an instant. Sam advised me to file an injunction, a legal measure that would block the HOA from taking any action until a court reviewed the dispute. This would buy time, but legal procedures cost money, and Daniel and I weren't wealthy. We scraped together what we could, deciding it was worth the investment. Within 48 hours, Sam filed the papers, and the HOA received a formal notice not to touch my property until further legal review. I suspected this would enrage Karen, and I was right. One evening, I heard rustling noises outside well past midnight. I peered through the window to see flashlights moving around in my garden. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone to record. I slipped out the back door, phone in hand. The flashlights belonged to two men with shovels. They looked startled when I caught them in the act. "Hey, this is private property," I shouted, my voice trembling with both fear and anger. They bolted, leaving footprints in the moist soil. My camera's night mode picked up enough detail to show that one of them wore a shirt with a local landscaping company's logo. The next morning, I told Sam, who suggested we call the police to report trespassing and attempted vandalism. While the men hadn't damaged much beyond a few trampled cucumber plants, the intent was clear. The police took a report, and I provided them with my footage. Though identifying them might be tricky, it established a pattern of harassment. And I had a strong suspicion who sent them. In the days that followed, I started noticing Karen's car cruising by my house at odd hours, as if she was checking whether my garden was still there. Neighbors whispered about the tensions, some even offering moral support or volunteering to stand guard. It felt surreal. How could a simple vegetable garden spur such drama? When the hearing for my injunction finally rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. Karen arrived with her own lawyer, a glowering man who insisted I was violating the HOA's landscaping rules. He cited a single sentence: "All yards must maintain the community's uniform aesthetic." My lawyer countered by producing pages of state legislation explicitly protecting a homeowner's right to grow produce. We also pointed out that the HOA's own guidelines made no mention of banning gardens. Karen's lawyer floundered, insisting that the rules gave the board broad authority. But then I dropped the bombshell. I had discovered, through a friend who worked at the county clerk's office, that Karen had signed multiple large contracts with a landscaping firm known as Green Vista Solutions without any record of board approval. The same firm whose worker I'd seen in my backyard at midnight. These contracts were suspiciously high-priced. My lawyer passed copies to the judge, who raised an eyebrow at the glaring inconsistencies. Karen's face went pale. Suddenly, the entire case shifted. It was no longer about my garden. It was about potential corruption and Karen's abuse of power. The judge granted my injunction, effectively barring the HOA from taking any action against my garden until a full investigation could be conducted. A wave of relief washed over me, but the story didn't end there. Because when the press got wind of a possible HOA landscaping scandal, they pounced, and Karen's next move would be so brazen, it nearly destroyed her reputation forever. An article appeared in our local news blog. Homeowner fights HOA over vegetable garden, finds evidence of shady landscaping contracts. Suddenly, neighbors who had been cautious started sharing their own experiences, inflated fines, forced landscaping changes with the same company, and threatened legal actions. It was a pattern of intimidation. Karen went on the defensive, emailing the entire community to decry fake news and claim we were disgruntled homeowners. She assured everyone that her deals with Green Vista Solutions were legitimate and that we were just stirring trouble. But her deflections fell flat when board members themselves began asking for a thorough audit. Some board members resigned, unwilling to be associated with Karen's tactics. Desperate, Karen tried to rally a meeting to vote me out of the community altogether, claiming I was breaching neighborhood peace. It was a ridiculous move. You can't just evict someone from their own home because of a backyard garden. The meeting turned into a fiasco, with residents demanding Karen step down. She refused, doubling down on her authority, but it was clear her grip was slipping. Around this time, the police followed up on my trespassing report. They showed me a photo lineup, and I identified the man with the landscaping logo who'd been in my garden. He was an employee of Green Vista Solutions, and the police had enough to question him. Rumor spread that he was willing to testify he'd been paid under the table to remove unauthorized gardens at Karen's direction. I never confirmed the rumor's accuracy, but the pieces fit too well. Finally, at the request of the outraged community, a formal audit of the HOA's finances took place. The preliminary results were damning: grossly inflated charges for routine tasks like hedge trimming, suspicious checks written directly to the name of the landscaping company, and no documentation of competitive bidding. Karen faced calls for her resignation, not just from the residents but from the remaining board members. She lashed out publicly, calling me a troublemaker who had brainwashed the neighborhood, but the tide of evidence was too strong. A special meeting was convened. Armed with copies of the suspect contracts and a statement from my lawyer, I attended alongside dozens of neighbors who'd grown fed up with Karen's reign. Karen tried to speak, but the audience heckled her, demanding transparency. The board announced that they had voted to remove Karen as president. A hush fell over the room, broken by applause and cheers from the crowd. Karen stormed out, her face a mixture of rage and humiliation. In the aftermath, the new board repealed the violation notices against my garden. They also enacted a policy explicitly allowing vegetable gardens, provided they didn't pose a health hazard or encroach on others' property. My cucumbers, tomatoes, and herbs remained safe, and they thrived. As for Karen, she disappeared from community affairs. Word on the street was she put her house up for sale, slipping away rather than facing further scrutiny. Some hinted that criminal charges could be in her future if the audit unearthed more serious misappropriations. Standing in my garden one bright morning, harvesting fresh tomatoes for dinner, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I never asked to become a crusader for homeowners' rights, but when Karen threatened to uproot my dream, I had no choice but to fight back. In doing so, I discovered I wasn't alone. Neighbors banded together against the injustice, proving that sometimes a simple vegetable patch can become a powerful catalyst for change. That's the story of how my little vegetable garden toppled a corrupt HOA president. If you enjoyed this tale of seeds, sabotage, and sweet victory, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and comment down below with your own HOA horror stories. Thank you for watching, and remember, never underestimate the power of a few vegetables to spark big change.